Royal families in history are some of the craziest ones ever, because like empires, they rise and fall and fall and rise and conquer and get conquered and many more things that can be reversed inside out, up and under. Same with the royal families through the history of mankind. I mean, think of it this way. As of 2025, there are like 43 sovereign states in the world with a monarch being the head of state. A lot of it even are under one royal rule, but before, this number was way bigger, except they just disappeared as time passed on. Like these families I'm about to show you. Third Dynasty of Ur-Nammu built the Third Dynasty of Ur in Sumer by pushing out rivals, locking down the region, and putting scribes to work glorifying everything with cuneiform bricks and legal codes. His son Shulgi kept the machine running by standardizing weights, reorganizing temples, and pretending he was some kind of divine mandate. Things stayed relatively calm through the next few kings. Amr-Sin, Shu-Sin, and then the last guy got the throne. Here's Ibisin. Ibisin came into power during a time when the empire was already cracking. Trade routes were breaking down, food production tanked, and every city that used to send taxes and soldiers started doing their own thing. The Elamites over in the east stopped playing nice. Amorite tribes started creeping in from the west. Ibisin sat on his throne in Ur and watched it all unravel, issuing letters begging for supplies and complaining about enemies taking cities like it was a neighborhood garage sale. He tried hiring mercenaries, but they turned out to be about as reliable as a cardboard soaked in lava. One of the empire's main grain-producing areas, the region around Ibisin and Kazalu, fell into enemy hands early, and that wiped out any shot at a serious food supply. One of Ibisin's biggest mistakes was putting a guy named Ishbi-Era in charge of Ibisin. Ishbi-Era was supposed to be a loyal governor, but the moment Ibisin got desperate and weak, Ishbi-Era stopped taking orders and started acting like he was king of his own mini-empire. Ibisin tried to get rid of him, but Ishbi-Era controlled the grain, the army, and most of the cities north of Ur, so all Ibisin could do was sit in his palace and watch Ishbi-Era take more land. Ibisin was eventually cut off from most of the country, and all he really had left was Ur and a couple cities clinging to his sinking ship of a dynasty. Around 1940 BC, the Elamites, who had been gaining power and getting tired of all the political games, made their move. They joined up with Amorite tribes who'd already been chewing up the western edges of the empire and went straight for Ur. There was no grand battle with glorious last stands. The city was taken, looted, and its people either slaughtered or dragged off. Ibisin was captured and hauled off to Elam, and that was the end of the Third Dynasty of Ur. Achaemenid Empire. The Achaemenid royal family's collapse started with Darius losing control over his satraps. After the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BC, where Alexander completely crushed Darius's army, Darius fled east trying to regroup. He had already been beaten earlier at Issus and watched his capital cities fall one after another. First Sardis, then Babylon, then Susa, and then Persepolis. His empire was being eaten alive city by city. His treasury, which had enough gold to pay armies for years, ended up in Alexander's hands without much of a fight. I keep saying Alexander, but who was Alexander? Let's just say he was great, and you'll get the idea. Anyway, Darius didn't have the power to hold anything anymore, not even loyalty from his own governors. As he ran deeper into Bactria, hoping to pull together another army, his own men saw him as a walking failure and figured they'd get a better deal with Alexander. So his satrap Bessus, along with a few other eastern nobles, took him prisoner and started parading him around like a trophy. They thought they could either hand him over or replace him with Bessus, who gave himself the name Artaxerxes and acted like that was enough to claim the throne. Bessus was betting on being seen as a Persian patriot stopping Darius from selling out to a foreign invader, but no one bought it. When Alexander caught up, he didn't find a captured king. He found a bleeding body tossed in a cart. Darius had been stabbed and left for dead in the desert by the same guys who were pretending to protect him. Alexander had him buried with full honors, but that was more political than sentimental. It made him look like he respected the Persian system, which helped him convince a bunch of Persian nobles and administrators to work with him. The royal line died with Darius. There wasn't some last prince fighting in exile or secret child raised by loyalists. It just ended in a ditch in the middle of nowhere. Bessus tried to keep the act going, declared himself king, and got some short-term support in Bactria, but Alexander didn't give him long. By 329 BC, Bessus was on the run too, and eventually, his own people turned him in. Alexander had him flogged, put on trial, and executed. That was the last anyone bothered pretending the Achaemenids still had a shot. Argead Dynasty. When Alexander the Great became Alexander the Dead in 323 BC, he didn't leave behind a clear plan. He had an unborn child with Roxana, and a half-brother named Philip, who had some kind of mental disability. So, the generals who'd fought beside Alexander, the ones who actually held the swords and knew how to command armies, were the ones calling the shots. Perdiccas took control first. He tried to keep the empire glued together by ruling as regent for both Philip and the baby, who'd later be named Alexander IV. But Perdiccas was basically walking around with a giant bullseye on his back, because the rest of the generals didn't want some guy pretending to be King Ibisin. Within 3 years, one of them killed Perdiccas after a failed campaign in Egypt, and that was the end of any serious plan to keep things unified. Ptolemy killed him, by the way. Philip was technically still king, and so was the infant, but neither of them had any actual power. The real control went to a group of competing warlords, known as the Diadochi, who were just waiting for the perfect moment to start slicing the empire like a birthday cake. Antipater took over as regent after Perdiccas, but when he died, his chosen successor, Polyperchon, ended up fighting with Antipater's own son Cassander. Cassander didn't care about any dynastic loyalty. He wanted the throne for himself, and he was fully ready to clean house to get it. Roxana had been hiding with her son, but Cassander tracked her down. He didn't kill them immediately. Instead, he locked them up and kept pretending everything was normal. Philip, on the other hand, had been dragged around for a few years. At one point, he was married off to Eurydice, one of the few Argead women left with political ambitions. By 317 BC, Philip was dead, Olympias was dead, and Roxana and Alexander IV were still alive, but only because Cassander hadn't pulled the trigger yet. He kept them under house arrest in Amphipolis for a few more years, probably trying to figure out the best time to kill a kid without sparking a revolt. But nobody was revolting. Everyone was tired. The empire had broken into chunks already, and each of the Diadochi was running their own mini-kingdom. Cassander finally ordered the murder of both Roxana and Alexander IV, around 310 BC. That was the moment the Argead dynasty actually ended. No more sons, no more brothers, no more mothers. Mora Dynasty. Chandragupta was the one who started this whole mess. He overthrew the Nanda dynasty around 321 BC, with the help of Chanakya, and set up the Mora Dynasty. He pushed his way into power by brute force, strategy, and the usual royal backstabbing. He built an empire so big it ran from Afghanistan to Bengal and down to the Deccan. When Chandragupta decided to give up his throne to become a Jain monk, he passed the crown to his son Bindusara, who kept things mostly intact. Bindusara didn't expand much, just held down what they already had and made sure nobody caused too much trouble. Then came Ashoka, Bindusara's kid, who was way too into war at the start. He killed a bunch of people in the Kalinga War, felt bad about it, and then went full Buddhist monk mode across the empire. He spent the rest of his reign building stupas, spreading Buddhism, and trying to act like he wasn't the same guy who wiped out half of Kalinga. After Ashoka died, things dropped off fast. His grandsons and great-grandsons started fighting over pieces of the empire. There was no solid successor, no real grip on the provinces, and local governors started doing whatever they wanted. Some even started acting like mini-kings in their own districts. The empire split up into smaller chunks, and central power meant absolutely nothing. Northern India started looking like a free-for-all. Brihadratha was the last guy left trying to pretend he still had power in Magadha. The guy had no army loyalty, no real money, and barely any land left to call his own. He was emperor in name only. Then Pushyamitra showed up. He was Brihadratha's own general, the one running the army, while Brihadratha smiled and waved during parades. During one of those parades, in 180 BC, Pushyamitra walked up to him, and then good night for Brihadratha. After that, the Mauryas were basically erased from political life. Pushyamitra cleaned house and made sure none of them had a chance to claw their way back. Chola Dynasty. After ruling for over 4 centuries with a capital first at Thanjavur and then Gangaikonda Cholapuram, the Chola dynasty collapsed under Rajendra in the late 13th century. Rajendra spent most of his reign trying to fight off a series of increasingly stronger Pandya invasions, starting with minor skirmishes in the mid-13th century that escalated into full-scale wars by the 1260s. The Pandyas under Jatavarman were steamrolling everything the Cholas once held. Rajendra got pushed further and further back from his authority, losing not just minor provinces but strategic strongholds one by one, with Kanchi falling early and Thanjavur not far behind. Rajendra lost political leverage and started making tribute payments to the Pandyas just to hold on to a tiny patch of land. By the 1270s, Rajendra had turned from king to glorified vassal, and by 1279, even that ended. The Pandya campaign in the 1270s finished off what remained of Chola authority. The final blow came when Maravarman Kulasekara, the successor to Jatavarman, marched into what little was left of Rajendra's domain and dismantled it. Rajendra disappeared from records right after that. No mention of exile, death, or resistance. He just vanished. His administration collapsed with him. No heir, no named successor, no last stand. The Pandya forces occupied the capital, absorbed the bureaucracy, took over temples, and replaced the Chola emblem with their own. The ancient line that traced its rulers back to Karakala and Vijayalaya was done. They didn't leave a shadow court, they didn't attempt a restoration, and they didn't reorganize under another banner. There wasn't enough power or support left for anything like that. Whatever remained of the Chola royal family probably ended up as minor landlords or monks, completely stripped of political relevance. Plantaginet family. By the time Richard became king in 1483, the Plantaginet family had already been chewing through itself for decades. The whole mess started way earlier though, with Edward and his pile of sons back in the 1300s. After a long line of badly handled successions and two branches of the family, the Lancaster and the York, fighting over the crown, England spiraled into the Wars of the Roses. First, there was Henry from the Lancasters booting out Richard from the York side. Then, Edward from York came back swinging. Then Edward died. Then his kid Edward was shoved aside by the king, who happened to also be his uncle. Then the kid Edward and his brother got locked up in the Tower of London. No one saw those kids again. Richard then made himself king, but nobody really liked him. He kept getting accused of being a murderer. Meanwhile, over in France, Henry was watching all this happen and figured he might as well throw his hat in the ring. Henry had some weak royal blood from his mother, Margaret, but more importantly, he had a ton of enemies of Richard backing him. So Henry sailed in, met Richard at Bosworth Field in 1485, and that was that. Richard got stabbed up, lost his crown in the dirt, and was dumped in a church grave. Henry didn't waste time. He married Elizabeth from the York side, which technically stitched the two warring houses together under the new Tudor label. Then he hunted down the rest of the Plantagenet stragglers. Edward, son of George, that George, the one Richard drowned in a barrel of wine, got locked up for years and then got his head erased by Henry after someone tried to break him out of prison. Hat was the last one with any real claim. A few distant cousins hung around, but they were powerless and mostly kept quiet if they wanted to stay alive. Aztec Empire. Moctezuma saw the beginning of the end when Hernán Cortés showed up in 1519 pretending to be some diplomatic guest but clearly had conquest written all over his armor. Moctezuma tried to deal with it by giving Cortés gifts and inviting him in, which backfired almost immediately. Cortés took Moctezuma hostage in his own palace, using him to control the city while Spanish reinforcements trickled in. Things didn't stay quiet for long. Tensions boiled over in 1520 when Pedro de Alvarado, left in charge while Cortés was away, led a massacre during a religious festival. That blew up the whole arrangement. The Mexica rose up, and during the chaos Moctezuma got hit with rocks from his own people. He died not long after, either from the injuries or something else, but the Spanish blamed the locals, and the locals weren't buying it. Cortés ran for it with his men during La Noche Triste, losing a big chunk of his forces while fleeing the city. But he wasn't done. He regrouped, built ships, rallied thousands of native enemies of the Mexica, and came back with a full army. By May 1521, Tenochtitlan was under siege. Cuauhtémoc, who took over after Cuitlahuac died of smallpox, was left defending a starving, disease-ridden, crumbling city while the Spanish cut off supplies and bombarded what was left standing. For nearly 3 months, Cuauhtémoc held out with whatever fighters he had, but it was a losing battle. The canals filled with bodies, the temples were shattered, and the people were dying faster than they could fight. By the 13th of August, 1521, Cuauhtémoc finally surrendered after trying to escape by canoe and getting caught. Hernán had him brought in front of everyone and forced him to hand over what was left of the empire. Tenochtitlan was demolished. The survivors were either enslaved, executed, or shoved into the margins, while the Spanish tore down the temples, built cathedrals, and renamed everything they could. Cuauhtémoc was kept alive as a political puppet for a few years, until 1525, when Hernán got paranoid during an expedition to Honduras. He had Cuauhtémoc dead. Valois Dynasty. This probably is the least violent way a royal family ended. Sebastian was the grandson of John III, and became king as a child after John died in 1557. Since Sebastian was still a kid, a regency ran the kingdom until he was old enough. By the time Sebastian was in his 20s, he was obsessed with launching a crusade against Muslim forces in Morocco. Ignoring the warnings of his court, ignoring military reality, and ignoring the fact that he had no heir, Sebastian marched into North Africa in 1578. He brought with him a massive army made up of Portuguese nobles, mercenaries, and volunteers. The whole campaign collapsed in the Battle of Alcácer Quibir, where Sebastian was killed. His body was never officially identified, but there was no serious doubt he had died in the battle. He had no wife, no children, and no direct line to take the throne. With Sebastian gone, The next in line was his elderly great-uncle Henry. Henry was already a cardinal in the Catholic Church, which made things awkward, because cardinals weren't supposed to have kids. Even worse, Henry was in his 60s and had no time to get married or change his church vows even if he wanted to. But he took the throne anyway and ruled as King Henry. For the next 2 years, Portugal was stuck with a celibate king, who spent most of his short reign trying to figure out who could take over after him. By the time Henry died in 1580, no heir had been secured, no compromise had been reached, and the whole country was up for grabs. Several hands tried to claim the throne. The most powerful was Philip, the King of Spain. Philip was the son of Charles V and had a direct connection to the Portuguese royal family through his mother Isabella, who was John III's sister. Philip claimed the throne and backed it with military power. The Portuguese nobility, worn out from the chaos and scared of war, caved. Philip's troops entered Portugal, and the Cortes of Tomar recognized him as king. Philip became Philip I of Portugal and ruled the country alongside Spain in a personal union. The last people left from the Aviz family either had no legitimate claim or couldn't pull together enough power to challenge him. Valois Dynasty. Okay, so here was the case. Henry III did not have a son. His brother, Francois, had died without any kids in 1584. That meant Henry's death left no one in the Valois house with a direct claim. The crown had to pass to someone, and that someone was Henry of Navarre. He was from the Bourbon branch, a distant cousin, Protestant, and not exactly the church's favorite person. France was already in the middle of the wars of religion, so throwing a Protestant king on top of that just added fuel to the fire. The Catholic League, backed by Spain and a bunch of French nobles, didn't want Henry of Navarre anywhere near the throne. Henry had to fight his way into Paris over several years. He had military backing but no real acceptance until 1593, when he gave up and converted to Catholicism. That shut the church up enough to let him walk into the city and claim the throne as Henry IV. He got officially crowned in 1594, but by that point, the Valois line was long gone. Long gone for the reason that in 1589, Henry III got stabbed in the gut by a Dominican friar named Jacques Clement. Henry didn't survive that hit. That alone was enough to end the Valois line. Catherine de' Medici, Henry III's mother and the last political muscle left in the Valois family, had died earlier in 1589. She had tried to juggle the Catholics and Huguenots for decades, but couldn't stop the whole thing from collapsing. Her death just cleared the path for the Bourbons to take over, without anyone left to hold on to the old name. The dynasty had been around since 1328, starting with Philip VI. They got the job after the Capetian line died out and France needed a male heir. The Valois kings ran the show through the 100 Years' War, the Renaissance, and several pointless internal power grabs. It went from Charles V trying to fix things to Charles VI losing his mind to Charles VII pushing the English out. Then came Louis XI stacking cash and power, Charles VIII running off to Italy, Louis XII getting nothing out of it, and Francis I burning money on wars. That led into Henry II, who caught a jousting lance in the face. After him, 3 of his sons took the throne one after the other. All of them died without sons. Every one of them ruled while religious war ate the country alive. By the time Henry III got stabbed, there were no brothers, no nephews, no cousins from the main Valois line to even pretend they had a shot. So that was it. The name ended with a knife to the gut and the rest of the mess handed off to the Bourbons. Chola Dynasty. Ryuku's king Shotai got dragged into the mess after Japan stopped pretending Ryukyu could stay a semi-independent kingdom. Even though Shotai still sent tribute missions to Qing China, Japan had other plans once the Meiji government started cleaning house after the restoration. Japan already made Ryukyu a domain in 1872, which looked like a demotion but was really just the first warning. They let Shotai keep his title for a few more years like it still meant something, but that was just smoke. By 1879, Japan stopped playing polite. They sent Matsuda Michiyuki straight to Shuri Castle with troops and told Shotai he wasn't king anymore. Shotai didn't resist, he didn't try to fight it, he just handed over the royal seal and left quietly. Tokyo shipped him off to the capital, gave him a marquis title so it looked like they were being generous, and parked him there with a pension. The Ryukyu government got shut down fast. Shuri Castle got turned into an administrative building. Okinawa Prefecture was announced like it was a local upgrade, but all that really meant was direct control by the Japanese central government. Ryukyu officials who used to answer to the Sho family got replaced by appointees from Tokyo. The bureaucrats started rewriting everything to follow the same system as the rest of Japan. Schools got turned into Japanese institutions. The language started getting pushed out, and traditional Ryukyu customs were marked as outdated. The Ryukyu aristocracy, including Shotai's sons, had to follow orders, or risk losing even the status they were barely holding on to. They weren't allowed to have political influence anymore. Just sit quietly in Tokyo with their noble ranks and smile for photos. Shojun, Shotai's son, ended up with the count title and followed the same powerless route, paraded as a Japanese noble with no say in what happened back home. In the end, change is the only thing that's permanent. Like life, empires, dynasties, families, and the likes are bound to end one way or another. But how it will end is up to circumstances that only time can tell. See y'all.